My name is Paul Pols. I'm a principal security expert at Fox IT, a Dutch cybersecurity company that's part of the NCC group. I've been working there as an ethical hacker for the last 7 years, so doing penetration testing and red team testing. Recently I wrote a master's thesis about unifying the cyber kill chain, which I did in order to analyze and compare and defend against the attacks of APT28, also known as Fancy Bear. The reason why I did this, because a lot of our clients are using the kill chain by Lockheed Martin, the cyber kill chain, but I found it to be incomplete for the type of attacks that we're actually doing. So I wanted to extend it to cover attacks from basically the very beginning to the very end. I'm going to explain today how I did that. First, go into the original kill chain from Lockheed Martin a little bit, then explain my research design, the case studies that I did into our red team attacks and the attacks of APT28, and then some of the research results. So first, for everyone to be on the same page, this is my depiction of the security model that's widely used in our industry to this day, I guess since the 1990s. You could call it the eggshell security model, which basically has this hard perimeter that's defending a very vulnerable inside from the big bad outside world. And defenders have gotten really good at trying to pierce through this perimeter. So maybe a decade or so they would go through a vulnerable web server, but nowadays we see most attackers are just piercing through this perimeter through spear phishing attacks. So they send an email and they use trusted paths that go right through this perimeter. For instance, an email, if you modify your payload a little bit or if it's something new, most antivirus products won't pick it up. You can compromise user in that way, get access to all the data that they have access to, and then use maybe HTTPS or something similar to exfiltrate it through those trusted paths again and to get that data. And basically this technique is being used by all sorts of attackers, so from script kiddies to nation-state actors. And the nation-state actors are, for me, the most interesting. And if you want to defend against these types of attacks, a lot of people are using the cyber kill chain from Lockheed Martin, which really focuses on APT, so the most advanced end of this spectrum of attackers. And their model basically has 7 steps, which supposedly every attack goes through. And their idea is that you can try to defend against each one of these phases. So from the top, you basically do reconnaissance into your target, you weaponize an object, you deliver that to your target, that is used to exploit the target, install your code, which gives you command and control over the system, which is like hands-on keyboard type of access, which allows you to get to do the action on objectives that you were originally after. So the nice thing about the model is that once you know the different phases of an attack, you can map your measures against these phases. So Lockheed Martin, being a military contractor, they think of it in military terminology like detect and deny and disrupt, etc. But you could also define these measures in terms of prevention and detection and response and intelligence, which is maybe a little bit more familiar within our industry. And also, the interesting thing about the model from Lockheed Martin is that it really changes the idea of the balance between attackers and defenders. Because what you hear a lot is what I call the defeatist adage, namely that attackers only have to find one flaw in a really large attack surface, and defenders have to do everything right to secure that attack surface against defenders. And the cyber kill chain from Lockheed Martin really changes this around, and it says that attacks are actually multi-phased, complex attacks that are progressions towards a target, and that just one mitigation can stop one of these attacks. So it really changes the balance between attackers and defenders. Now, the important thing to realize here is that it really relies on this premise underlying the model, namely that the adversary must progress through each stage of the chain before it can achieve its desired objective, and that just one mitigation disrupts the chain. Even though the model is very widely used, it's not without its critiques. So for instance, it's been said that the model is disproportionate on an attack time scale because these first 6 steps of getting an infection inside a target network may take very little time, so hours, maybe days, while this last step of the action on objectives may actually take much longer, such as weeks or even months. Another point that has been made is that the model tries to overcome like traditional thinking, like perimeter focus and malware prevention, but it actually has a number of phases that are really determined in much of a similar way to what it's actually trying to prevent. So it's trying to prevent the compromise of the first system beyond the perimeter, which is still focusing on the perimeter. Also it's targeted towards malware prevention thinking because it talks about weaponization of an object that's being installed on systems, etc. So what some have said is that because there are also other ways to sort of breach this perimeter initially, maybe supply chain attacks or physical social engineering, insider threat, maybe we should be just conceding this first line of defense, conceding that the perimeter will be breached, and then think how are we going to defend once that perimeter has been breached. So this was the objective of my research. How are we going to do this? So this slide basically summarizes like 6 months of excruciating hard work of my life. Starting at the very left is the original kill chain from Lockheed Martin. Then in the gray to black spectrum, you see my literature study. So I looked into some blogs from Lalibert and Reiner, some scientific work, for instance, Bryant, Black Hat presentation by Sean Malone. Also the MITRE attack framework. I also used that because there are some interesting and very structured ways of thinking about the kind of activities that attackers may perform beyond the perimeter. And I combined everything from that literature study to make a first hypothesis of what a unified kill chain could look like that could really explain these attacks from the very beginning to the very end. So starting from this first hypothesis, I then had something that I could use to test in a number of case studies to see if it would work, to explain all the behavior that I actually saw in the attack. So I did that for 3 different red team case studies for which I obviously had all the data, like the report and the PCAPs and everything, my original notes. And then after refining the model through these red team case studies, I used it to test it against the attacks of APT28. So I just want to talk to you a little bit of the results that I had. So first, to give you an idea of the red team case study, this is the first case study that I did. Here you see how we originally got access to the target network. So basically, the domain of the original kill chain from Lockheed Martin, just are doing some recon, weaponizing a Microsoft Office document, phishing an employee, getting them to click on it, open the macro, execute our code, make it persistent on the system to gain access to the target network. So this is basically what you're defending against if you're using Lockheed Martin kill chain. So what was interesting to see is what actually happened after we got access to the target network, which is usually called action on objectives. So this is usually all clustered as one phase. And you see that actually there's a lot of potential to defend against these kinds of attack beyond the perimeter, and that's actually happening within the locus of control of your organization because it's within your network. So just to go through it real quick, there are like 3 unique attack paths in here. On the left-hand side, we compromised the workstation, escalated privileges on the workstation, got the local admin password. We're able to use it on all other systems that were also using that password, ending up with access to like 200 systems with different kind of users on there, also allowing us to bypass the 4i principle and basically be able to modify a $1 billion transaction. Another path that allowed us to do the same thing was by compromising a server, extending that again to gain access to more servers, which included one of the servers that was used to do these kind of transactions, which also would have allowed us to do the same thing. And the last one was getting domain admin rights, so basically the highest rights that you can get inside the Windows Active Directory, and in that way also be able to do all the workstation and server kind of attacks that we did. So this basically summarizes all 3 case studies that I looked into. Each one of these rows, or actually the columns, is a unique attack path that I identified. So you can see there's 9 in total. And what's interesting to see here, again, a lot of potential to defend against these kinds of attack after the perimeter is initially breached, which is which you can see by looking at the black line. Another interesting point to see here is that each of these attack paths is unique, and that the phases occur in different orders, and that sometimes they may be skipped or occur out of their expected sequence. Now, the reason why that's important to realize is because it falsifies the premise of the original kill chain, namely that an attacker must progress successfully through each stage of the chain, and that one mitigation disrupts the chain and the adversary. Now, I realize this depiction with 18 phases is actually kind of hard to grasp, so I did my best to make it a little easier to explain to people. So I clustered the different phases of these attacks in 3 columns. Basically, the first one is about gaining an initial foothold inside the target network. So compromising a system behind the perimeter, which is basically the domain of the original kill chain. After that, you can use that infection to pivot to the internal network and then perform a number of tactics or phases, such as discovery of systems, escalating privileges, executing code, getting access to credentials, and using those credentials to perform lateral movement. This is basically a game of sort of getting more access and getting more access to systems, getting higher privileges, and sort of moving like that through the network. And once you have sufficient access, you can use that access to collect data, to exfiltrate that data, or to perform target manipulation. Now, target manipulation is a little different. It could be compromising the integrity of systems or the availability of systems, which could also be an objective, even though most people are generally focusing on the confidentiality through collection and exfiltration. And they basically fit to the objectives of the overall attack. What was interesting to see is that in one of the attack paths there was actually a segmented network. So as you can see, there's an entire extra column in there because we had to first compromise the office environment and then gain access to a stepping stone, which allowed us to move to the critical infrastructure segment. And once we got there, our original credentials that we were able to harvest were no good anymore, and we basically had to start anew. So the fact that they segmented the network and isolated the identity and access management system really forced us as an attacker to make our path much longer. So this basically shows how strong of a measure that can be. And it also showed how versatile the model was, because this is basically from going from here, this middle column, it was just repeated. So it's basically a loop that you can go through for as many segments as you need in order to gain access to your final target. Now, having created this model, I wanted to see obviously how it would hold up against the attacks of real-world APTs, such as APT28, also known as Fancy Bear. Maybe you've heard of them. They are one of the 2 actors that was found in the network of the Democratic National Committee before the elections here in 2016. Their attacks have been attributed to the GRU, also known as Russia's military intelligence services, most recently by a Mueller indictment. And the group has been active for quite a while, but they have moved from traditional espionage to performing covert influence campaigns in which they manipulate the public opinion and the domestic politics of foreign nations through the collection and release of misinformation. So just to show you what these kinds of attacks look like, here's The most simple example in which they just phish someone for their credentials for an externally accessible webmail environment. If you fill in your credentials here, they can just harvest everything that's available within your account straight away, which is much easier than the kind of red team attacks that we were just modeling. So it's interesting to see from my point of view. Another kind of attack is actually much more similar than as the kind of attacks that we were doing, in which they send a spear phishing email with a malicious Word document. The Word document actually included two zero-day vulnerabilities. First one in the EPS format, which allowed them to execute code, and then another vulnerability in Windows kernel to gain the highest privileges on the system, allowed them to deploy their malware with the highest rights on the Windows system. If you look at the malware that's being used by APT28, it actually consists of multiple stages, a bit more complex than the kind of malware that we were using as a red team. Basically, they have different kind of ways to first inject the malware, so either through email or through watering hole attacks. Then they have the first stage malware, which is basically used for reconnaissance. If they find that the target is interesting, they can deploy their second stage malware. In this way, they can sort of shield it from researchers. And if it's a particularly interesting network, they can deploy their pivot malware, which allows them to attack other systems in the internal network, or use their USB stealer malware to even gain access to air-gapped networks. Now this, again, is a depiction of the unique attack paths that I saw in the APT28 case study. You see two of them, so C41 and C43, in which they basically don't even have to this organizational perimeter because they can just attack externally accessible email systems. Then there's a couple in which they use all the information that they have to do very targeted spear phishing attacks, and in that way compromise the right person straight away, leveraging all the information that they previously gained because they're intelligence services, and then they can perform their attack like that. But there's also a number of ones in which they had to perform additional steps once they compromised this initial system beyond the perimeter. So that could either be because they were unlucky in who they compromised, it wasn't the right person, they don't have access to the right information, or because their attack requires more than what you can do from any individual workstation. For instance, the TV5 Monde attack has been attributed to them, in which they blacked out a TV station, which required flashing routers. That's something you cannot do with just a spear phishing attack. Another way to look at the research results is this comparison between the kill chain that I developed and some of the other kill chains that I used in my research. So the cyber kill chain from Lockheed Martin, you can see it actually performs quite well at the beginning of these attacks, but after that just clusters everything as action on objectives. Our red team did quite a bit better, but generally we stopped short of actually collecting and exfiltrating data or manipulating critical production systems because clients get a little anxious if you want to attack their critical production systems. But it's actually something that would be very good to test, because as you can see, each one of these different phases, these tactics were necessary to explain the attacks that were performed by APT28. So if you want to know if you can prevent that, detect that, respond in time, then you actually need to allow red teams to perform these things as well. To come back to the balance between attackers and defenders, I mentioned these two views. Actually, having done my research, actually shows that the game between attackers and defenders is much more balanced than either of the other views would portray, namely that a successful mitigation in a layered defense strategy by defenders may thwart one of these complex and multi-phased attacks. But an attacker might also find another way to get to their target if you mitigate them in any one of those phases. So what should you do then? Well, for instance, think about how are you going to defend against these attacks, because if you know that some of these phases may be skipped or occur out of sequence, maybe you should be focusing on the points that connect different parts of these attack chains. So if you can create choke points that you know that you can force attackers to go through, to pivot through, that would be a really interesting target to focus your defense on. So, for instance, if you have a stepping stone that's used for system management purposes, that's something that you really want to focus all your efforts on. Also, take into account systems that are dual homed, etc., which could be used as a path for attackers. That's also something that's like high risk and that you should be focusing your efforts on. Having discussed all this, here are some of the sort of extra added values that I'm hoping to attain with the unified kill chain that I developed. So first of all, it combines some of the previous research that has been done in one comprehensive model. So you have the cyber kill chain from Lockheed Martin, you have MITRE's attack framework, which are really good in what they do, but they only show you part of the total picture. So if you want to explain to someone how a complex attack works nowadays, neither of these models really shows you the whole picture. So I'm hoping that this model will allow you to explain that to people. Also, it improves over the scope of the original kill chain, which is supposedly should encompass the whole attack, and it improves over the time-agnostic nature of the attack framework, because the attack framework, it includes tactics, but it's really interesting to know how they occur in actual attacks. So if you see one of these behaviors in your network, you want to know what should I be looking at what happened previously and what should I be looking at that might have happened next. Also, some of more minor points, for instance, I changed the definition of weaponization a little bit, which is very narrow in the definition of the original kill chain. If you broaden that a little bit, you can also include things like looking at typo squatted domains, maybe using that for intelligence purposes. Another point would be separating exploitation from social engineering. So in the original kill chain, this is all called exploitation. But if you're mapping measures against this, there's actually a big difference in trying to prevent exploitation of a system and social engineering of your user. So one might be patch management as a fix. If you're trying to prevent social engineering of your employees, obviously patch management is not the thing that's going to save you. So if you separate those two, it's much easier to think about possible measures to prevent that. Also, what I just mentioned, the crucial role of choke points in these kinds of attacks. And another thing that I think is nice about the model that I created is that it extends the way in which you can use the attack framework a little bit. So the attack framework, it focuses on the collection and exfiltration of data, which is all about confidentiality. But obviously we all know in the CIA triad, you can also target integrity or availability of systems. There's nothing in the attack framework currently that allows you to take that into account. So by adding target manipulation, you can include that into what you're looking at. And also, the final addition that I did was adding a phase called objectives, which basically explains more of the high-level strategic objectives that an actor may be after. And if you take that into account, then you may also be thinking about the kind of assets that they may actually be after. So where is that data stored? How are they going to get to that target? So that also allows you to think about this problem in terms of attack paths that may exist inside your network and then trying to cut off these paths at some point. Well, having said that, brings me to the end of my presentation for today. If you want to read a little bit more about it, I've registered this domain, unifiedkillchain.com. Currently, it just redirects to my master's thesis. It's 100 pages, so I don't expect you to read the whole thing. Before the end of the month, I intend to publish a white paper which is a little more accessible, maybe some blog posts on the subject, but they will all be accessible from this same point. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul.